A woman I'd never met grabbed my arm at gate C14, pulled me half a step closer, and said, "Please, I need you to pose as my husband for a few minutes. I'll explain everything, I promise. Just please." I remember the exact texture of her voice, the way fear made it come out clipped and low, barely above the noise of the terminal around us. Flight announcements, rolling suitcase wheels, someone's toddler crying 2 gates down. My first instinct was confusion, bordering on alarm, the kind of reflexive wariness anyone would feel with a stranger's hand suddenly on their arm in a crowded public space. But there was something underneath her panic that stopped me from simply pulling away and looking for airport security. Some quality in her eyes that read less like a scam or a scene and more like genuine, cornered fear. Before I could even ask what was happening, 3 men in dark suits were walking toward us across the terminal, with the kind of purposeful stride that made the whole gate area go quiet around them. "Elena," the oldest of the 3 men said, stopping a few feet away, his eyes moving from her to me with an appraising coldness that made my stomach drop. "Who is this?" "My husband," she said, before I could think of anything else to do but nod along, my heart hammering against my ribs as I put my arm around a total stranger's shoulders and tried to look like a man who belonged there. The oldest man studied me for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze moving over my travel clothes, my boarding pass still visible in my other hand, as though weighing whether the story added up. I forced what I hoped looked like an easy, slightly annoyed smile, the kind a tired traveler gives when interrupted by strangers, and said something forgettable about the delayed flight, hoping it sounded natural enough to hold. I had no idea, standing at that gate with my arm around someone I'd known for exactly 90 seconds, just how much more was about to unravel before either of us boarded a plane that night. My name is Liam. I'm 32, a structural engineer flying home to Chicago after a work conference in Miami. The kind of unremarkable business trip I'd taken a dozen times before, without anything more eventful happening than a delayed flight. I mention my job because I think it's part of why I didn't just pull away from Elena's hand the moment she grabbed my arm. Years of assessing whether a structure is actually sound versus simply appearing sound had given me a habit of pausing to look closer before reacting, even in a situation as strange and sudden as this one. I'm generally a cautious person by nature, not someone who inserts himself into strangers' problems without thinking it through first. My friends have always described me as the one who reads every clause of a lease twice before signing, who double-checks a restaurant bill, even when the total looks obviously right. But something about the raw fear on Elena's face in that first instant, before she'd said a single word to me, cut through whatever hesitation I might normally have had. I've thought about it many times since, how a stranger's fear can sometimes communicate more honestly, more immediately, than any explanation could. Elena, I'd learn over the next several hours, was 28, the daughter of a man named Victor, who ran an import-export business with connections stretching across several countries. She'd grown up in a household where her father's business and her family's personal life had never been fully separate, where decisions about her future had been discussed, for as long as she could remember, in the same rooms and in the same terms as decisions about shipping contracts and supplier relationships. She told me, in the hours that followed, that she'd spent most of her adolescence being introduced to her father's business associates the way other kids might be introduced to family friends, always polished, always poised, always aware, even as a teenager, that she was somehow part of the presentation. I want to be honest that I know how strange this entire situation sounds from the outside, and I understand why a person hearing it secondhand might assume exaggeration somewhere in the telling. I've had to sit with that same disbelief myself, even having lived through it, because some of what I learned that night felt more like something out of a film than something happening to an ordinary woman at an ordinary airport gate. But I've come to understand, since then, that these situations rarely announce themselves the way fiction suggests they should. They unfold quietly, in ordinary settings, dressed in the language of family obligation and business necessity, which is exactly what makes them so difficult for the people living inside them to name clearly, even to themselves. The three men retreated after a tense few minutes, apparently satisfied, for the moment, with Elena's explanation, though the oldest one, her father's associate, she told me quietly once they'd walked far enough away, lingered at a nearby gate, watching us with an attention that made it clear he wasn't fully convinced. Elena and I sat down together, close enough to maintain the fiction if anyone glanced our way, and she told me, in a low, careful voice, what was actually happening. Her father had, over the past year, arranged for her to marry the son of a business partner, a man she'd met only a handful of times and felt nothing toward, beyond a kind of resigned unease. The marriage, she explained, was tied to a significant debt her father owed this partner, a debt that had grown, through a combination of bad investments and worse decisions, to a size her father could no longer repay through ordinary means. Elena's marriage, in the family's private calculations, had become the collateral. She'd been planning her escape quietly for months, saving money her father didn't know about, arranging to visit a grandmother in Denver who genuinely was unwell, using the trip as cover for what she actually intended, disappearing from her family's reach long enough to build an independent life somewhere they couldn't easily follow. Her father, she said, had apparently grown suspicious in the past week, sending these men to intercept her at the airport, just in case her trip wasn't quite what she'd claimed. She told me about growing up, watching her mother defer to her father on nearly every major decision, including, eventually, decisions about Elena's own future that were made in rooms she wasn't invited into. She'd learned, over years, to read the mood of a room before understanding the details of what was actually being discussed in it, a skill, she said, had made her both very good at avoiding conflict and very bad at recognizing when conflict was actually something she needed to start. As we sat there, waiting for our delayed flight, I noticed small details that unsettled me the longer I turned them over. The careful, rehearsed way Elena described her father's business dealings, like someone who'd learned exactly how much to say and how much to leave out. The way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever the man watching us shifted position at his gate. A folded document, visible for a moment in her open bag, with a letterhead I didn't recognize, and a string of numbers that looked less like a personal document and more like something financial and formal. None of these details, on their own, told me anything concrete. That was, I think, exactly the nature of what Elena had been living inside for months. A situation controlled and careful enough that nothing about it looked, from any single angle, quite as serious as it actually was. That folded document in her bag wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the first thread I noticed of something much larger than a difficult family and an unwanted arranged marriage. Our flight was delayed nearly 3 hours, which gave Elena and me far more time together than either of us had expected when she first grabbed my arm. Somewhere in that stretch of waiting, once the man watching us had finally moved on, she showed me the folded document from her bag, admitting she'd taken it from her father's office weeks earlier, without fully understanding what it meant, keeping it only because some instinct told her it might matter eventually. It was a financial ledger, several pages of transactions between her father's company and the business partners, dense with terminology I recognized only in fragments from working alongside project financiers over the years. What I could make out, piecing through it with her, wasn't simply a story about a struggling businessman owing an old friend money. The transactions described shipments that, based on the dates and volumes listed, didn't correspond to any goods either company had a legitimate reason to be moving in those quantities. Elena mentioned, quietly, that she'd overheard her father once, late at night, mention the word clearing in a tone that had stuck with her, though she hadn't understood, at the time, what it referred to. I'm not an expert in financial fraud, but years of reading contracts and cost breakdowns for construction projects had given me enough of an eye to recognize when numbers didn't add up to the story attached to them. What Elena's father's ledger seemed to describe wasn't simply debt. It looked like money laundering, disguised through inflated shipping invoices, with the marriage arrangement functioning less as a simple debt settlement and more as a way to formally bind two families together, insulating both of them from the kind of scrutiny that might otherwise fall on either business individually. I traced my finger along a few of the entries with her, both of us hunched over the pages in our cramped economy seats, keeping our voices low, even though the man beside us had long since fallen asleep. Some of the shipment values were absurdly disproportionate to the goods listed beside them. Small crates of what the ledger described as textiles, valued at sums that made no sense for the weight and volume recorded. It was the kind of mismatch that, in my own field, would have triggered an immediate audit if it ever showed up in a project's cost report. Elena's arranged marriage wasn't just an old-fashioned, uncomfortable family obligation. It was quietly functioning as part of a much larger financial arrangement between two men who needed each other's silence and cooperation far more than either of them needed a wedding. We didn't confront anyone at the airport, and Elena made clear, once the shock of what we were looking at settled, that she needed to think carefully before deciding what to do with what she'd found. Something in both of us went quiet and deliberate, instead of panicked, understanding that acting rashly with information this serious could put her in real danger before either of us fully understood who else might be involved. Once we finally boarded, delayed but still together on the same flight, since Elena's actual ticket happened to be for the same route, we spent much of the flight quietly discussing what she should do next. I gave her what practical guidance I could, drawing on the little I understood about financial fraud from my own professional world, suggesting she consult someone who actually specialized in this kind of thing, rather than trying to interpret the ledger alone. During those weeks, I found myself checking my phone more often than usual, half expecting a message from Elena that never came at the times I braced for it, understanding, slowly, how strange it was to have become genuinely invested in a stranger's safety after a single delayed flight together. We talked most evenings, brief, careful conversations about what she was finding, what Priya was advising, small updates that felt enormous given what was actually at stake for her. Once we landed, I helped her find a financial fraud attorney through a professional contact of my own, a man named Gregory, who occasionally consulted on construction financing disputes and, it turned out, had a colleague who specialized in exactly this kind of cross-border financial investigation. Elena met with that colleague, a careful, methodical woman named Priya, within the week, bringing the ledger and everything she could remember about her father's business dealings over the years. Priya's initial review confirmed what I'd suspected on the plane, though she was careful to caution Elena that proving it formally, in a way that would hold up with authorities, would take considerably more documentation than a single ledger page. Priya explained, patiently, that financial crimes cases involving cross-border shipping records often took months just to establish jurisdiction, let alone build a case strong enough to bring charges, and that Elena needed to be prepared for a process far slower and more emotionally taxing than the dramatic confrontation she might have imagined in the immediate aftermath of that night at the airport. Over the following weeks, Elena, working carefully and at real personal risk, gathered what additional records she could access from her father's home office, during visits that, to him, looked like an estranged daughter slowly softening toward reconciliation, rather than an active investigation building against him. Priya's investigation, once it had enough documentation to formally review, turned up something Elena hadn't known, something that reframed the entire arrangement for both of us. Elena had an older cousin, Sophia, who'd left the family under circumstances nobody discussed openly, years before Elena was old enough to fully understand what had actually happened. Priya's team tracked Sophia down through old business records, connecting her, years earlier, to a nearly identical arrangement. A marriage to a different business partner's son, tied to a different debt her own father, Victor's brother, had owed at the time. Sophia had gone through with that marriage, reluctantly, and the arrangement had quietly financed a similarly disguised laundering operation for nearly 3 years before Sophia finally left both the marriage and the family entirely, cutting off all contact rather than risk being pulled into legal exposure herself once she understood what she'd unknowingly been part of. Elena had never met Sophia herself, only heard her name mentioned occasionally, always followed by an uncomfortable silence that discouraged further questions. Learning now that this silence had been protecting a decades-old version of exactly what Elena herself had almost been forced into made the whole family's careful avoidance of the topic suddenly make a painful kind of sense. What struck Elena hardest, hearing this, wasn't just that the scheme had happened before. It was learning that her father had watched his own brother use a daughter this way, understood exactly how the arrangement worked, and exactly how it had eventually cost that family its relationship with Sophia entirely, and had chosen, deliberately, to run the same play again with his own daughter, rather than learn anything from what it had already cost someone else. This wasn't a father cornered into a single desperate decision by circumstance. It was a family pattern, refined across a generation, treating daughters as financial instruments whenever the business math required it. Elena didn't confront her father alone. Priya helped her prepare a formal report for federal financial crimes investigators, careful to structure Elena's involvement in a way that protected her legally as a witness, rather than exposing her to liability for information she'd only recently understood the full weight of. I wasn't present for the formal proceedings that followed, but Elena called me once it was underway, describing how quickly her father's explanations fell apart once investigators laid out the shipping records alongside the marriage arrangement's timeline. The same pattern Priya had identified months earlier, now backed by considerably more documentation than the single ledger page that had started everything. She told me, months into the process, that the hardest part wasn't the investigators' questions themselves, but the strange, disorienting experience of watching her own childhood reframed, document by document, into evidence. Birthday parties that had doubled as networking events, family trips that had coincided suspiciously with certain shipments, a lifetime of ordinary memories that now carried a second, colder meaning she hadn't been prepared to see clearly all at once. Her father tried, at first, to frame the marriage as simple tradition, then as a genuine match between two young people, each explanation thinner than the last once investigators produced records showing the arrangement had been discussed, in writing, explicitly as debt collateral months before either of the two people involved had ever properly met. By the time the business partner's own records were subpoenaed, corroborating nearly every detail from Sophia's account decades earlier, there was little left of either man's story to defend. The investigation into Elena's father's business took months to fully resolve, longer than either of us expected, ending eventually in criminal charges related to money laundering and financial fraud that Elena, painfully, had to testify about as part of the case against him. The marriage arrangement dissolved entirely once the business relationship underlying it collapsed under investigation, freeing her from an obligation that had shaped years of her life before she'd ever had the chance to build one of her own choosing. Elena reconnected with her cousin Sophia during the process, the two of them finally able to talk openly about experiences neither had felt safe discussing with anyone in the family for years. They met in person for the first time in over a decade, at a small cafe Sophia chose specifically because it had no connection to anything either family had ever touched, and spent nearly 4 hours comparing notes on a childhood that, they realized together, had shaped both of them far more similarly than either had ever understood, while it was still happening separately to each of them. Sophia told her, gently, that she wished she'd had someone in her own corner the way Elena had found in a stranger at an airport gate, a comment that meant more to both of us than either of us quite expected. Elena moved to a new city entirely during the months the investigation unfolded, taking a job unrelated to anything connected to her father's business, building, deliberately and carefully, a version of her life that belonged only to her for the first time in years. She told me once that the strangest part of that new independence wasn't the freedom itself, but how long it took her to trust that no one was going to show up and quietly redirect it the way her family always had before. Elena and I stayed in touch after that flight. First, through the strange adrenaline-laced bond of what we'd been through together, and slowly, over the following year, into a real friendship that neither of us had anticipated the moment she grabbed my arm at gate C14. Whatever it eventually becomes beyond that, we're both taking slowly, aware of how much upheaval her life has already gone through without needing to rush into anything else complicated on top of it. Not everything closed the way anyone might have wanted. Elena's relationship with her father is gone now, likely permanently, and she's had to grieve a version of her family she'd always hoped, quietly, might someday exist, even as the reality of it kept disappointing her for years. I don't think that grief fully resolves. I think you learn, slowly, to carry it differently. What I gained wasn't just an unlikely story to tell at dinner parties, though I'll admit it's become exactly that more than once. What I gained was a real, humbling reminder that sometimes the biggest decision of someone's life happens in 90 seconds at an airport gate, and that choosing to trust a stranger's fear, even briefly, without demanding a full explanation first, can matter more than either person fully understands in the moment. I think about how close Elena came to boarding a different flight that day, back into a life shaped entirely by other people's decisions about her future, and how much of what changed that trajectory came down to a stranger deciding, in a matter of seconds, to trust her fear instead of questioning it. None of it looked like an escape at first. It looked, for a few tense minutes, like an ordinary couple waiting for a delayed flight. So I'll leave you with the question that stayed with me since that terminal. How much of someone's life can be quietly decided by other people, long before that person finds the courage or the opportunity to reclaim it for themselves? And if a stranger grabbed your arm tomorrow and asked for a few minutes of your trust, would you give it to them?